As Chef Raphael finished another night at his Seattle bistro, an unusual sound from the back alley made him pause. When he stepped out into the rain-slicked alley, he found a little girl with a mysteriously swollen belly, frantically searching through the garbage. Her hollow eyes and trembling hands spoke of a desperation that went far beyond mere hunger. The sight of her distended abdomen on such a young frame made his blood run cold. Something was terribly wrong. What Raphael would uncover about the true cause of this innocent child's condition and the dark reality behind her suffering would shake him to his core. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today, and if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The rain drummed softly against the large windows of Cielo, a small bistro nestled in a narrow side street near downtown Seattle. Inside, the ambiance contrasted sharply with the cold outside. Warm Edison bulbs hung low over the tables, casting a soft amber light across the room. The restaurant was lively but not overcrowded. Groups of diners chatted over glasses of wine, savoring each carefully plated dish. Steam wafted from plates of braised lamb, garlic-infused pasta, and a hearty seafood stew. The intimate energy in the room was one of comfort and satisfaction. Behind the swinging door to the kitchen, Chef Raphael was in his element. Tall and lean with an air of quiet authority, he moved gracefully between his station and the preparation tables, orchestrating his small team. Tonight's orders were steady but manageable, allowing Raphael the luxury of taking time with each dish, admiring the way the garlic browned just so, or how the rosemary crisped atop the lamb shank. Raphael had always found solace in the kitchen. It was a place where he could lose himself in the rhythms of chopping, stirring, and plating, the sizzle of a pan, the aroma of herbs, and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and delicious. These were the things that grounded him, that gave his life purpose. As he worked, Raphael's mind wandered to his journey to this moment. He'd come a long way from his troubled childhood, from the streets where he'd once scavenged for food. Cooking had been his salvation, a skill he'd honed over years of dedication and hard work. Now at 35, he owned this small but successful bistro, a testament to his resilience and passion. At 9 p.m., Raphael slid the last dish of the day over to the wait station, a plate of pan-seared salmon, nodding to the waitress to take it out. As he did, he heard a sudden, sharp noise from outside, a faint thud and rustling from the back alley where the restaurant's dumpster sat. Raphael's brow furrowed slightly. It wasn't unusual to hear the occasional noise from the alley. He was familiar with the sounds of scavenging from the growing homeless population in the area, but something about this noise felt different, almost urgent, tugging at his attention. He paused, spatula in hand, listening intently. The sound came again, a little louder this time. It wasn't the usual rummaging he was accustomed to hearing. There was a desperation to it, a frantic quality that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Raphael glanced at the clock, debating with himself. He'd learned from his 10 years running Cielo that it was often better to let people be if they were rummaging through trash. During his first few years in the neighborhood, he had tried to stop the activity, only to end up with people angrily shouting at him, or worse, retaliating against the restaurant by leaving graffiti or trash. Over time, he'd learned to let things be, and that people would usually come by later, after closing hours. But tonight an odd feeling nagged at him. It was more than just curiosity. It was a pull, an instinct he couldn't quite explain. Setting down the plated dish, Raphael signaled his sous chef Matthew to cover him for a moment. "I'll be right back," he said, already moving towards the back door. "Just need to check on something outside." Matthew nodded, seamlessly taking over Raphael's station. "No problem, chef, I've got it covered." Raphael stepped out of the kitchen and walked through the narrow hallway leading to the back door. The rain was steady, and he pulled his coat tighter as he pushed open the door to the alley, squinting to adjust his eyes to the dim streetlight filtering in. At first, all Raphael heard was the sound of clinking bottles and the rustling of plastic bags. But then, by the dumpster, he saw a small figure, a young girl no older than 10 or 11, her clothes thin and damp, clinging to her as she frantically searched through the trash. She was soaked, her dark, tangled hair plastered against her head, her face pale against the night. Despite the rain, she seemed entirely focused on rummaging, pulling scraps out with a strange intensity, as though she was on a tight deadline. Raphael stood there for a moment, frozen in place, taking in the scene before him. The girl's desperation was palpable, and it stirred something deep within him, a memory of his own past, of times when he too had searched through garbage for something to eat. He called out, his voice gentle but firm, "Hey, are you all right?" The girl froze, her hands still on a half-torn piece of bread she'd just pulled from the trash. She looked up at him, wide-eyed, like a deer caught in headlights. For a split second, Raphael registered the look in her eyes, wary, hollow, yet brimming with a desperation that chilled him even in the warmth spilling out from the kitchen door behind him. His eyes couldn't leave the sight of her swollen belly, as big as a pregnant woman in her second semester. The incongruity of it, a child's face above a swollen abdomen, made his breath catch in his throat. And then, just as quickly, she clutched the scrap of bread to her chest and darted into the shadows, disappearing before he could say another word. Raphael stood there for a moment longer, the rain soaking through his chef's coat, his mind reeling from what he'd just seen. The image of the girl, her hollow eyes, her swollen belly, was burned into his memory. He felt a deep, unsettling mix of concern and helplessness. He wanted to follow her, to make sure she was safe, to offer her something more substantial than scraps from a dumpster. But he knew from experience that chasing after her would likely only frighten her more. Besides, he had a restaurant to attend to. With a heavy heart, Raphael turned back towards the kitchen door. As he reached for the handle, he paused, looking over his shoulder one last time at the spot where the girl had disappeared. Back in the warmth of the kitchen, Raphael tried to shake off the encounter, though the image of the girl's pale face and swollen belly lingered in his mind. He moved back to his station, declaring to his team that it was time to wrap up. Everyone got into gears, but Raphael could feel his movements lacked their usual fluidity. His mind kept drifting back to the alley, to the girl who'd vanished into the night. After a few minutes of distracted cleaning up his station, Raphael couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He turned to his sous chef, Matthew, who was busy packing up the leftover sauce reduction. "Matt," he said, his voice low, "did you see a girl with a swollen belly out there earlier?" Matthew raised his eyebrows in concern. "Another one scavenging?" he asked, while pacing toward the fridge and sliding the wrapped bowl inside. "They're getting braver, I guess. Used to wait until after we closed." Raphael nodded, trying to describe the girl. But she was just a kid, maybe 10, 11 years old, if that. She had this big belly. Overhearing, Kenny, the busboy, leaned in, chuckling darkly. "Big belly, huh? Probably pregnant," he suggested with a casual shrug. Raphael's expression hardened, an unsettling realization dawning on him. "She looked too young for that," he insisted, recalling her thin frame, wild hair, and the hollow look in her eyes. "You'd be surprised," Kenny said nonchalantly, wiping his hands on a towel. "If a girl's had her period, it can happen, even at 10. Raphael was taken aback, feeling a sick twist in his stomach. The casual way Kenny spoke about it made Raphael's skin crawl. He wanted to argue, to insist that it couldn't be true, that there had to be another explanation. But a part of him knew that Kenny might be right, and that thought filled him with a mixture of anger and sadness. Trying to change the subject and divert his unease, he directed everyone to finish their tasks, calling the evening's end in the kitchen. Raphael moved through his usual end-of-day routines. He turned off the oven, let the kitchen fans whir down, and wiped down his station one last time. Matthew gathered the laundry bag, Kenny emptied the grease trap, and Lewis, the kitchen hand, put the last of the clean dishes back into the cabinets. With the kitchen quiet and the work done, Kenny suggested grabbing a beer at their usual spot and gesturing to the others. Matthew shook his head, mentioning that his wife and kids were waiting for him at home, but Lewis agreed, nudging Raphael to join them. "Come on, chef," Louis said, his tone light and teasing. "You look like you could use a drink. Rough night?" Raphael politely declined, explaining that he just wanted to go home. Louis, ever the joker, grinned and teased him. "What, don't get anyone waiting for you at home, do you, Raphael? Come on, have a beer with us, can't always be serious." Raphael managed to smile, brushing off the invitation with a light-hearted excuse. "I've got my own way of winding down," he replied, heading toward the back door to lock up. "Maybe next time, guys." As they parted ways, Louis, feeling playful, threw a careless joke over his shoulder. "Just don't go getting some kid pregnant on your way home, chef." Raphael didn't respond to the joke, feeling the discomfort gnaw at him again as he remembered the girl's face. The comment, meant in jest, hit Raphael like a punch to the gut. He knew Louis didn't mean anything by it, that he had no idea about the girl in the alley. But the casual way he joked about such a serious matter made Raphael's skin crawl. As he locked up the restaurant, Raphael found himself thinking about the differences between his life and those of his staff. They were good people and hard workers, but their lives were so far removed from the realities of the streets. They could joke about things like teen pregnancy because it wasn't real to them, just something they saw on the news or in movies. He shook his head, trying to clear the dark thoughts. It was late and he was tired. He needed to go home, get some rest, and approach the situation with a clear head in the morning. Maybe then he could figure out a way to help the girl if she was still around. Stepping into the rainy night, Raphael pulled his coat tighter and made his way to his car. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, the few people still out hurrying along with umbrellas or ducking under awnings to escape the persistent drizzle. But as he neared his car, he noticed a small figure in the shadows, a familiar swollen belly and tangled hair partially illuminated by the glow of a distant street lamp. His heart rate quickened as he realized it was the same girl from earlier. This time she was speaking with a man who was leaning against a wall, his hood pulled low over his face. Raphael watched from a distance as she handed him a few crumpled bills, and he slipped something into her hand in return. Raphael's breath caught, and his mind raced with the suspicion that this was a drug deal. "Is the girl pregnant and taking drugs?" he mused. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, concern for the girl's safety, anger at the man who seemed to be taking advantage of her, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. What could he do? Call the police? Confront them directly? Neither option seemed likely to help the girl in the long run. Disturbed but unsure of what to do, Raphael decided to follow her as she left. He knew it wasn't the most ethical choice, but he couldn't bear the thought of letting her disappear into the night again without knowing she was safe. Keeping a far enough distance, he watched as she ducked down one street after another, navigating the maze of alleys and side streets like a practiced local. Her small figure moved with purpose, clearly familiar with this urban landscape in a way that spoke of long experience. As he followed, Raphael's mind raced with questions. Where was she going? Did she have a home? And what about her family? Where were they in all of this? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about her situation. Eventually, she reached a small, tattered tent, tucked against a wall in an alley. Raphael waited, hiding behind a nearby wall as he watched her slip inside the tent. He felt a pang of sadness and guilt, wondering how long she'd been living this way, and if anyone else had noticed or tried to help. The realization that this tent, this fragile makeshift shelter, might be her home hit Raphael hard. He thought about his own comfortable apartment, about the warm kitchen he'd left behind at Cielo. The contrast was stark and painful. For a moment he considered turning back. He'd seen where she lived now. Maybe that was enough. But something kept him rooted to the spot, a nagging feeling that he couldn't just walk away, not when she might need help. After a few moments of internal debate, Raphael's concern outweighed his hesitation. He took a deep breath, stepped out from his hiding place, and approached the tent. He knew he was crossing a line, intruding on her privacy, but his concern outweighed his hesitation. He had to make sure she was okay. "Hey, are you all right?" he called out softly. "Little girl, where are you parents? Do you live here alone?" There was a rustling sound from inside the tent, and then the flap opened slightly. The girl emerged cautiously, clutching a frayed blanket around her swollen belly, shielding herself defensively. Her eyes flashed with a mix of distrust and defiance as she recognized him. "Mum. Intent," she murmured, whispering in a voice so faint he had to lean in to hear. "We live streets." Raphael's heart clenched. He knew that look, young, tired, scared. He took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I saw you with that man earlier." But before he could finish, the girl's face twisted in anger, and she snapped, "Why are you following me?" "I'm sorry, I... Raphael stuttered, clearly taken by surprise at the girl's sudden distress. "Go away, I don't have anything. I'm sorry for going through your rubbish earlier, but just go..." "Listen," Raphael continued. "What's your name? I don't mind about the rubbish, it was just... That man from earlier, what did he sell to you?" "Stalker! This man's stalking me!" Her voice rose suddenly, shrill and accusing, echoing off the alley walls. Raphael was stunned by her reaction. He'd expected wariness, maybe fear, but not this sudden burst of anger. He raised his hands in surrender, trying to calm her. All right, he said, backing away. "I'm leaving, okay? I just wanted to help. I won't bother you anymore." She watched him warily as he turned and left, slipping back into the shadows of the alley. Raphael's heart was pounding as he made his way back to his car. He felt a mixture of guilt and frustration. He'd only wanted to help, but he realized now how his actions must have seemed from her perspective. A strange man following her to her home in the middle of the night. As he walked, he berated himself for his lack of forethought. Of course, she'd be scared and defensive. Living on the streets, she probably had to be constantly on guard against threats. And here he was, a grown man she didn't know, showing up at her tent in the middle of the night. But even as he questioned his actions, he couldn't shake the image of her swollen belly, the desperation in her eyes as she'd rummaged through the dumpster. He knew he couldn't just walk away and forget about her. With a heavy sigh, Raphael unlocked his car and slumped his back against his seat. He started the engine and sat there for a moment, running a hand through his hair. He felt utterly out of his depth. He was a chef, not a social worker or a counselor. What did he think he was going to accomplish? Raphael pulled away from the curb and drove through the misty streets, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The encounter with the girl had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He found himself scanning the sidewalks, half expecting to see her again, and then, just a few blocks away from where he'd left her, he caught sight of her again. She was standing on the corner under a dim streetlight, her swollen belly even more pronounced as she talked to a well-dressed man in a suit. Raphael slowed his car, his heart racing. The scene filled him with unease. He watched as the girl clutched at the man's arm, clearly pleading with him for something. Her body language was desperate, almost frantic. Suddenly, the man yanked his arm back and, with a scowl, kicked her to the ground. The girl stumbled, falling forward onto the wet asphalt, her belly hitting the ground first. The sound of her cry cut through the night air, piercing Raphael's heart. In that moment, all of Raphael's hesitation vanished. His instincts took over. He parked his car abruptly, tires screeching slightly on the wet road. He got out and walked briskly toward them, his face set in determination. The man in the suit saw Raphael approaching and sneered, assuming the worst. "If you like 'em this young, be my guest," he said with a disgusted smirk. "I'm not interested in a pregnant kid." Fury tightened Raphael's chest, his fists clenching at his sides. The casual cruelty of the man's words, the implication behind them, made him want to lash out. But he held back his anger, focusing on the girl. She was more important right now. The man shrugged and walked away, leaving Raphael to tend to her. He knelt beside her, noticing a trickle of blood on her swollen belly, her eyes filled with humiliation and pain. "Are you okay?" Raphael asked softly, his voice thick with concern. "Can you move?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, tinged with a little anger, as she recognized him, the man who had followed her to her tent. She tried to push herself up, wincing as she did so. "Hey, let me help." Raphael offered a hand and the girl took it despite her hesitation. Who was that man earlier? Do you know him? He asked. The girl shook her head. No, I was just asking him for help. I was very hungry, but he misunderstood, Raphael asked, and the girl nodded. I don't get it. Everyone I met seems to hate me just by looking at my belly. Well, except you who followed me to my tent. The girl rubbed her belly and Raphael saw blood trickling from the side that hit the ground. I'm sorry for scaring you earlier. I should have introduced myself first. He said, My name's Raphael and I'm a chef at the restaurant you visited. The girl nodded, but she didn't introduce herself. Raphael did not question her, thinking it must have been a rough night for a little girl like her, and he didn't want to add more pressure. I see you have a wound on your belly. Let me call the ambulance for help. I think we need to have you checked. Are you pregnant? Raphael pulled out his phone to call 911, but the girl grabbed his wrist, her eyes wide with desperation. Please, no police, she pleaded, her voice cracking. She looked terrified, as if the mere presence of any authority would bring disaster. Raphael hesitated, torn between following protocol and honoring her fear. He knew the right thing to do would be to call for help, to get her proper medical attention, but he also understood fear of authority, the instinct to avoid official involvement at all costs. Seeing her distress, he made a decision. He ended the call, putting his phone away, and said gently, All right, no police, but you're hurt. Will you let me take you somewhere safe? The girl looked at him warily, clearly weighing her options. After a moment, she gave a small nod, too worn down to argue further. Carefully, Raphael helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and he put a steadying hand on her shoulder. My car's just over there, he said, pointing. We'll take it slow, okay? Raphael led the girl to his car, careful to move slowly so as not to startle her. She was silent as she settled into the passenger seat, keeping her gaze fixed on her lap, clearly uncomfortable but resigned. As Raphael started the car, he realized he wasn't sure where to take her. A hospital seemed like the obvious choice, but she'd made it clear she didn't want official involvement. His apartment wasn't an option. Taking her there wouldn't be appropriate. Then an idea struck him. You said you're very hungry. I'm going to take you to my restaurant, he said softly. It's closed now, but it's warm and safe. We can clean up that cut and get you something to eat. Is that okay? The girl nodded slightly, still not looking at him. Raphael drove carefully through the quiet streets. He kept glancing at her, worried about her injury and her overall state. They arrived at Cielo and Raphael parked in the back. He helped the girl out of the car and led her to the back door, unlocking it and guiding her inside. As they entered the empty kitchen, the girl looked around, clearly surprised to be welcomed into such a warm, clean place. She seemed unsure whether to sit or stand, so she hovered near the entrance, watching Raphael warily. Raphael moved with deliberate slowness, not wanting to startle her. He grabbed a first aid kit from under the sink, then gently gestured for her to sit down. Let's take a look at that cut, okay? He said softly. She hesitated, then settled onto a kitchen stool, pulling her thin shirt up just enough for him to see the fresh scrape on her belly, her movements still guarded. Raphael cleaned the wound carefully, noticing the swollen belly's unnatural roundness. It didn't look like a typical pregnancy. There was something off about it. My name's Luna, the girl began. Raphael looked up, trying to hide his surprise at her opening up to him. You told me your name's Raphael. Yes, Raphael answered. Luna, that's a beautiful name. He offered a smile. Are you hungry? I could warm up some soup. Luna nodded, her eyes lighting up slightly at the mention of food. Raphael moved to the refrigerator, pulling out a container of leftover soup. As he heated it on the stove, he kept his movements deliberate and slow so she would feel at ease. The kitchen filled with the warm aroma of the soup, and Raphael saw Luna relax slightly, her posture becoming less rigid. He poured the soup into a bowl and set it in front of her with a spoon and some bread. Eat as much as you like, he said. There's plenty more if you're still hungry after. As Luna began to eat, Raphael sat across from her, keeping his distance but watching her carefully. He had so many questions, but he knew he needed to tread carefully. For now, he was just glad she was safe and getting some food in her stomach. The silence in the kitchen was broken only by the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl. When Luna had finished about half the bowl, Raphael decided to gently broach the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Luna," he began softly, "can I ask you something?" Luna looked up from her soup, her eyes wary but not hostile. She gave a small nod. "Are you pregnant?" Raphael asked, his voice gentle and non-judgmental. Luna's brow furrowed and she looked down at her swollen belly. I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How does someone get pregnant?" Raphael was speechless for a moment, taken aback by her question. It revealed a level of innocence and lack of basic knowledge that he hadn't expected. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Well," he started carefully, "usually it happens when a man and a woman sleep together. Has anyone ever done that with you?" Luna shook her head, saying that she only lived with her mom in the tent. Raphael felt a mix of relief and confusion. If she hadn't been with anyone, then what was causing her belly to swell? "Luna, how long has your belly been like this?" he asked. "It's been growing for a while," Luna replied, her hand resting on her stomach. "It hurts sometimes." Raphael was now sure she needed proper medical attention. Whatever was causing the swelling, it wasn't a normal pregnancy, and it could be something serious. He decided to tread carefully, not wanting to push her too much, and asked about the man he saw her with earlier. "And the man I saw you with earlier, the one you gave money to, was he selling you something?" Luna's eyes filled with tears and she nodded slowly. He was a doctor," she said, her voice trembling. "He sometimes sells drugs on the street, but he was kind enough to help me get my mother's medicine." Raphael's heart sank. He had a feeling he knew where this was going, but he let her continue. "It took me a while to collect the money," Luna went on, her words coming faster now. "And just now, after having the money and meeting the man, I finally have my mother's medication, but—" Her voice broke and she looked up at Raphael, her eyes brimming with tears. "My mother died when I reached the tent earlier, the same time when you showed up at the door." Raphael's chest tightened. The thought of this young girl struggling alone on the streets, scavenging for food, and losing her mother without anyone to turn to, weighed heavily on him. He wanted to reach out and comfort her, but he held back, unsure if she would welcome the contact. "I'm so sorry, Luna," he said softly. "That must have been terrible for you, and I'm sorry for scaring you earlier. You must have been terrified." Luna wiped strays of tears on her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I was scared. I thought you might be a police asking me about the doctor. I have heard around here that the police were looking for him and my mother had died and I didn't know what to do." Raphael took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to suggest would be difficult but necessary. "Luna," he said gently, "I'm here now and I'm not a police, just a chef. I think we need to go back to your tent. We need to check on your mother." Luna looked at him, fear and uncertainty clear in her eyes, but after a moment she gave a small nod. Raphael stood up slowly. "Okay," he said. "We'll go together. You're not alone in this anymore, Luna, I promise." After Luna finished her meal and Raphael was done tending to her wound, he asked her to go back to her tent to check on her mother. Luna looked at him long enough before she finally agreed. Her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. Raphael led her outside to his car. They drove in silence, the rain falling softly against the windows. The streets were nearly empty at this late hour, the city seeming to hold its breath. Raphael glanced at Luna occasionally, noticing how small and vulnerable she looked curled up in the passenger seat. They arrived back at the tent in the dimly lit alley, and Raphael followed Luna as she approached the tent slowly, pausing before lifting the flap. She glanced at him, her face pale and scared. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside with Raphael close behind. Inside the tent, Raphael's worst fears were confirmed. The woman, Luna's mother, lay motionless, her skin ashen and cold. There was no sign of life, and the sight filled Raphael with a deep, solemn sadness. He knelt beside the woman, gently reaching out to check for any faint sign of a heartbeat or breath. But he already knew. Luna stood frozen, her eyes fixed on her mother's still form. Raphael turned to her, his heart breaking for the young girl who had lost everything. "Luna," he said softly, "I'm so sorry, your mother, she's gone." Luna's face crumpled and she let out a heart-wrenching sob. Raphael instinctively moved to comfort her, wrapping his arms around her small frame as she cried. He held her gently, letting her grieve, knowing that no words could ease this pain. After a few minutes, Luna's sobs quieted to soft whimpers. Raphael gently pulled back, looking into her tear-stained face. "Luna," he said gently, "we need to call someone. The police need to know about your mother, and we need to get you some help." Luna's eyes widened in fear. "No police," she whispered frantically. "They'll take me away, please, no." Raphael took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't just leave the situation as it was, but he also understood Luna's fear. He needed to find a way to handle this that would keep Luna safe and get her the help she needed. "Luna, listen to me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I promise I will help you, but we have to do this the right way. We need to call the police so they can take care of your mother properly, and we need to get you to a doctor to check on your belly. Will you trust me?" Luna looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Raphael squeezed her shoulder gently, then pulled out his phone to dial 911. "Yes, I need to report a deceased individual," he told the dispatcher, his voice low and steady. "I'm with her daughter. She's very young and alone." As he gave the necessary information, he kept his free arm around Luna, offering what comfort he could. As he ended the call, Raphael looked down at Luna. "They're on their way," he said softly. "It's going to be okay. I'm going to stay with you through all of this. You're not alone." Luna leaned into him, her small body shaking slightly. Raphael held her close, his mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was determined to see it through. He couldn't abandon Luna now, not when she needed help the most. Moments later, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet night as red and blue lights illuminated the narrow alley. An ambulance and a police car pulled up, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls of the surrounding buildings. Luna tensed, clutching her blanket more tightly. Raphael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "They're here to help. I'm not going anywhere." Two police officers stepped out of their car, one with a notepad, the other scanning the area. Raphael greeted them, explaining the situation, and they listened, glancing at Luna with sympathy. He led them to the tent, where they confirmed the mother's death. The paramedics carefully removed the body from the tent and prepared it for transport. Raphael watched as they worked, feeling a deep sadness for the woman he had never met, whose life had ended in such difficult circumstances. One officer, a woman with kind eyes, knelt to talk to Luna. "Hi, Luna," she said gently. Her eyes fell on Luna's swollen belly. Her expression changed slightly, a mix of concern and confusion crossing her face. "I'm Officer Sarah. Can you tell me about your mother?" Luna looked down, her hands unconsciously resting on her swollen belly as she gathered her thoughts. Her voice was soft and unsteady. "My mum. We've been on the street for a while now," she began, her gaze drifting past Officer Sarah to some distant memory. "She's been sick for a long time, coughing a lot, barely able to get up some days. I tried to help her, to find food to keep her warm, but—" Luna's voice broke and she swallowed hard. "Today, she didn't wake up. I tried to wake her, but she was so cold. I don't have anyone else." She looked up at Officer Sarah, her eyes brimming with tears yet holding a quiet strength. Officer Sarah nodded, writing down her statement. "Thank you, Luna, for being so brave. We're going to take good care of you, okay? But to do that, we need to take you to the hospital to have your belly checked." Luna's eyes widened in fear and she looked to Raphael. He knelt beside the officer, meeting her eyes. "It's going to be all right," he said. "I'll come with you if that's okay." He looked up at Officer Sarah, who nodded her approval. "That would be fine," she said. "We'll need to ask you some questions too, sir." Raphael nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." As they prepared to leave, Raphael noticed a social worker had arrived on the scene. She introduced herself as Ms. Thompson and explained that she would be overseeing Luna's case. "We'll need to find a safe place for Luna to stay," Ms. Thompson said. "Do you know if she has any relatives?" Luna shook her head, her eyes filling with tears again. Raphael felt a surge of protectiveness. "If it's possible," he said, surprising himself, "I'd like to offer to be her temporary guardian, at least until we can figure out a more permanent solution." Miss Thompson looked at him appraisingly. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morales, Raphael Morales." She nodded. "We'll need to do some background checks and assessments, of course, but if everything checks out, that could be a possibility. For now, let's focus on getting Luna the medical attention she needs." As they walked towards the ambulance, Raphael kept his hand on Luna's shoulder, offering silent support. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was committed to seeing it through. Whatever happened next, he was determined to ensure that Luna would be safe and cared for. After the police and social worker coordinated care, Raphael accompanied Luna to the hospital, staying with her throughout the way and in the waiting room. He had even stepped into the police car with her, leaving his car parked where he had left it. The stark white walls and antiseptic smell of the hospital were a sharp contrast to the dark, damp alley they had just left. Luna sat quietly beside him, her small frame seeming to shrink even further in the large hospital chair. As Luna was taken in for an examination, Raphael remained outside, reflecting on the day's events and feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He paced the waiting room, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. How had his life changed so dramatically in just a few hours? While waiting, Raphael's exhaustion caught up with him, and he eventually drifted off to sleep in one of the uncomfortable waiting room chairs. In his sleep, he had a vivid dream about his own past. He recalled the loss of his mother during childbirth and the subsequent years with his distant alcoholic father. In the dream, he saw himself as a small boy being abandoned by his father. The memory was painfully clear. His father's car driving away, leaving him alone on the street to survive on his own. Raphael found himself wandering the streets, scavenging for food, feeling the gnawing hunger and desperation that had been his constant companions during those dark days. But then the dream transitioned again. This time, he saw the elderly couple who had found him rummaging through their trash. In his dream, their faces were kind and concerned as they approached him, offering him not just food but a home and a chance at a stable life. The warmth of their kindness contrasted sharply with the cold desperation of his earlier memories. As the dream faded, Raphael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The couple had given him a second chance at life, and now he had the opportunity to do the same for Luna. Dawn was breaking as Raphael woke, the pale light of early morning filtering through the waiting room windows. He stretched, his body stiff from sleeping in the chair, and looked around, momentarily disoriented. A doctor in a white coat approached him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Morales?" she asked. Raphael stood quickly, his heart racing. "Yes, that's me. How is Luna? Is she okay?" The doctor's expression was serious but not grim. "Luna has a severe bacterial infection," she explained. "It's likely due to malnourishment and exposure to unsanitary conditions, which has caused the swelling in her belly. She'll require antibiotics, hospitalization, and nutritional support." Raphael listened intently, relief washing over him that it wasn't something worse, but concern still gnawing at him for Luna's overall health. "We'd like to keep her here for at least a week for treatment and observation," the doctor continued. "Do you know if there's any family we can contact?" Raphael shook his head. "No, she doesn't have anyone. Her mother just passed away." The doctor's expression softened with sympathy. "I see. Well, we'll need to coordinate with social services for her care after she's released. In the meantime, would you like to see her?" Raphael nodded eagerly. Yes, please. As they walked to Luna's room, Raphael made a decision. I'd like to cover her medical expenses, he said firmly. The doctor raised his eyebrows in surprise but nodded. That's very generous of you, Mr. Morales. I'll pass this information to our billing department, and Mrs. Thompson, the social worker, will return to the hospital once Luna is feeling a bit better. She's still resting right now. They reached Luna's room, and Raphael took a deep breath before entering. Luna lay in the hospital bed, looking small and vulnerable amidst the tubes and monitors. Her eyes lit up slightly when she saw Raphael. Hey, Luna, he said softly, approaching her bedside. How are you feeling? Okay, she mumbled, her voice weak. What's going to happen to me now? Raphael sat down in the chair next to her bed. Well, you're going to stay here for a little while so the doctors can help you get better. And then, he paused, gathering his courage, if it's okay with you, I'd like to offer you a place to stay, with me. Luna's eyes widened. Really? You'd do that? Raphael nodded. Yes, I would. We'll need to talk to the social workers and make sure everything is okay, but if you want, I'd like to be your foster parent, at least for now. Luna's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. She reached out and took Raphael's hand. Thank you, she whispered. Raphael squeezed her hand gently. You're welcome, Luna. We're going to figure this out together, okay? As they sat there, hand in hand, Raphael felt a sense of peace settles over him. He knew there would be challenges ahead, legal hurdles, adjustments to their lives, and the long process of healing for Luna. But he also knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this was the right path.